Welcome to the Sociable Dog Pod, the podcast for anyone who wants to know more about the extraordinary relationship we have with our dogs and why we don't always understand each other. We'll be digging into the roots of dog behaviour so we can get to know our best friends better and make our lives with them a little richer. We'll be busting some of those sticky myths about why they do what they do, exploring how they learn and trying to interpret their language. We'll talk science, we'll share stories, have some laughs and make some interesting discoveries all along the way. I'm Si Wooler and I've been working with dogs and their humans for more than 15 years. So let's talk dogs. Zazie Todd PhD is an animal behaviour expert and the award-winning author of WAG, The Science of Making Your Dog Happy, and Purr, The Science of Making Your Cat Happy. Her third book, Bark, The Science of Helping Your Anxious, Fearful or Reactive Dog, is out now. Zazie is the creator of Companion Animal Psychology blog and has a column at Psychology Today. She has a PhD in psychology, is an honours graduate of the prestigious Academy for Dog Trainers, and has an advanced certificate of feline behaviour with distinction from International Cat Care. Originally from the UK, she lives in Maple Ridge, BC, with her husband, a dog, and a cat. Zazie, I know you as an academic and a hands-on dog trainer, but I've heard you dissect a heavy academic paper as well as give advice and insight on the life of a jobbing trainer and behaviour specialist. Now, I imagine that you need to wear different hats at times because, let's face it, the language you might use to discuss complex scientific methodology isn't going to be the same as that you use for a dog or cat parent whose pet is causing them some anxiety or who just needs to learn some basic behaviours. So how do you reconcile those two very different worlds?
For me, I feel very lucky to be in both of those worlds and able to draw on things from both of those worlds because I love talking about the science. I think canine science is absolutely fascinating and it's so relevant to our everyday lives with dogs. And those are the things that I like to pull out to share with people. So I love sharing with people things that will make a difference to them that we know from science. And I think that's a really fun thing to do. And my background is in human psychology. It's really psychology of language. And actually, it was a lot of talking about how we talk about risk and the best ways to frame things for people. So in a way, that was kind of quite close to science communication anyway. So I'm just drawing on that. And I feel very lucky to have that to draw on when I'm talking to people about things. So to me, it's not a dilemma. It's like these two things are really enmeshed together because the science makes such a difference to everyday life. And I think it's really helpful for people to know a bit about both.
Presumably, you've managed to develop skills in the way that you talk about them to different audiences. So in your academic world, if you're talking to a conference of academics and scientists, that might be different from the way that you put those scientific ideas across to a more public audience.
It would be quite different, but I don't go to those kinds of academic conferences anymore.
Oh.
For myself, I prefer to wait for a paper to appear in a journal and to have been peer reviewed before I write about it on my blog. So I'm waiting for that. Even though I'm interested in what they talk about at the conferences, I'm quite short of time, so I don't get to go to those. But I do teach a course at Canisius College on communicating anthrozoology for the master students there. And anthrozoology is the study of the human-animal bond. So it's teaching students how to communicate about the science in ways that ordinary people will be interested in. So I still have that academic interest in it as well, but I'm more focused on the writing and the training side of things.
Great, because that's something that you and I have in common, is that deep interest in that relationship between people and their pets.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the most important thing, isn't it? And that's why we get our pets. But a lot of the things that people do inadvertently might damage that relationship or make things worse for them. And I'm thinking, especially if people use outdated dog training methods these days, we know that there's a lot of science to tell us that outdated dog training methods that use aversives have risks, including fear, anxiety, increased aggression. the dog being more pessimistic, and also that worst relationship with the owner or the guardian, whatever you want to call them. And I think that relationship is absolutely central, and it's the most important thing for us to protect when we're working with someone and their dog. So yeah, absolutely.
Now, the follow on to that question, it sort of takes the shape of a compliment to you. That is that you manage to make quite complicated processes very accessible for people. If as trainers, we start getting into the nuances of how classical conditioning and operant conditioning works, and we've said a little bit about this already, but we're pretty soon going to lose an audience, aren't we, who just want to know what they should do, or perhaps even where they're going wrong. That curse of knowledge can make it easy to download everything that degrees and diplomas and PhDs have taught us. So how do you decide what is relevant? What changes the direction a client or reader might go in, and what to leave out? What's your test for that?
Well, you're right. That's a real challenge because there is so much technical information that we have and so much expertise that we have that an ordinary person has to learn, but we can't teach all of it at once. So there might be cases where someone is really struggling and they're thinking, I've tried doing this and it doesn't work. And you or I could look and we could say there's some very simple mistakes that they're making. And if we fix that, then it's going to start working much, much better. Or in reality, there might be several mistakes that someone's making because, of course, an ordinary person doesn't have those years of experience. It's much, much harder for them to pick this up. And I think often people think it's easy, like you get some food and you train your dog. That sounds easy, but there's a big technical skill there and it takes people a long time to learn. So the thing is, what's the most important thing that we need to teach them in that moment? And it might be something to do with getting the timing right, especially in counter conditioning. It might be the timing that they need to make sure that the dog has seen the thing that they consider scary before you start to give them the treats. And I'll just add that thing that they consider scary, hopefully is at a level where they're not scared, they're actually quite happy. But anyway, that timing can be really important there. But also it could be something like talking about the kinds of treats that people are using, because they make a big difference too. And especially if you've got a fearful or anxious dog, someone might be frustrated that food doesn't seem to be working. But when you look at the kind of food that they're using, someone like you or me can say, of course, that's not working because it's not good enough. It needs to be really amazing food, like the ultimate snack or something. So it's whatever will make the biggest difference in that moment. And you don't want to overwhelm people. You just want to stick to the thing that will make the biggest difference.
I suppose there are other things that might potentially get in the way as well, because you've touched on it already, which is about aversive training. And it's very likely that some people that you're going to be asked to help, you're not the first stop on their journey. Previous stops might well be trainers who've encouraged them to use more aversive approaches.
Yes, because dog training isn't regulated. And unfortunately, there are still trainers out there who use outdated methods. And even more unfortunately, some of them even manage to become quite famous despite using these totally outdated methods. So people can be very unlucky. They might go to a trainer or even read a book that tells them to use aversive methods and they try it. So they try the choke chain or the tugs on the leash or yelling at the dog or even a shock collar. And all of these things risk making things worse, especially if the dog is fearful and anxious. Then someone might come to us having already been through this series of things with a trainer or trainers who unfortunately have not helped. And that's a real shame because then sometimes people are absolutely at their wits' end. And you have to explain that although they did these things with the dog's best interests in mind, they were trying really hard for their dog, but unfortunately it's had these adverse effects and now they have to learn how to do things differently. But making that change is so, so important. And we know that most people do use positive reinforcement. I think it's something like 99% of dog guardians, according to one study from Dogs Trust. But the thing is that unfortunately a sizable minority still use aversive methods at least some of the time. And that has risks for the dog and they need to stop.
And actually, you raise a good point there because it's really important, isn't it, not to blame people who are coming to you for help. They're getting that from all quarters, aren't they? That your dog's aggressive or your dog's behaving in this way or that way. It must have been mistreated.
Yeah, and people can feel so guilty and they can have so many negative emotions themselves around the fact that their dog is struggling. Very often the person is really struggling too. And I think we have to recognize that and recognize that it's really hard for people when their dog is fearful, anxious, reactive. It's embarrassing, it's frustrating. There's a whole host of negative emotions that can go along with that. And the last thing we want to do is blame someone for having a dog like this because it's not their fault. There are so many different factors that go into creating a fearful, anxious, or reactive dog that it's not one single thing that someone has done. It's not that necessarily that anyone has even mistreated the dog because genetics plays a role. The puppy's experience while in the womb even plays a role, how comfortable or stressed the mom is, early experiences in the nest, what happens during the sensitive period for socialization. Bad experiences can play a role. And then there's also the role of pain or medical issues as well. So it's a whole set of things that go in, and someone can do everything right and still end up with a fearful or anxious dog sometimes. And I think that helps people to know that because it's not their fault. It's really important that we don't blame them for it. And some of those outdated methods, unfortunately, do involve blaming the guardian, and that's just not right.
Yeah, it can be a real lottery, can't it? You've written about anxious, fearful, and reactive dogs, but there are different types of fear and anxiety, aren't there? Talk to me a little about the different issues you might see and how they might manifest themselves.
So, fears and anxieties are actually really common. And there's one study that suggests that almost three-quarters of dogs have some kind of fear or anxiety. And the most common one would be fear of loud noises, especially fear of fireworks. And depending on the study that you look at, that's between a quarter and half of all dogs are afraid of loud noises, which is a huge number. So it's no wonder that people struggle when it's fireworks night or Halloween or something. But then other common fears would be fear of strangers, so as in people that the dog hasn't met before, fear of dogs that they don't know, fear of new situations. Those are very, very common as well. Other fears might include compulsive behaviors or resource guarding or separation related issues as well. And for a lot of these fears, actually, the method that we use is the same, regardless of what the thing is that the dog is afraid of. So, counter conditioning is a really powerful technique that we can use to change the dog's emotions and to teach them that the thing that they previously considered scary actually is really wonderful and lovely because it predicts this wonderful party in which they get amazing treats. And that's a very powerful technique, but it can take time to work with. And I think all of these issues, unfortunately, they can sometimes take a very long time. And that's perhaps especially the case with the separation related issues.
Separation anxiety is something that we get asked a lot about. We get asked to talk about it on the podcast, and I get quite a lot of inquiries about it. Personally, I think it's a specialism, so I tend to refer it out, separation anxiety. But what is it? Deep dive a little bit for me into what separation anxiety is and why people find it so challenging.
So I have a chapter in Bark on separation related issues, and I would agree with you that it's a specialism. There are trainers who specialize in this, and I would recommend going to one of those people if someone is having trouble with this. So separation related issues are when the dog basically can't be left alone without going into some kind of panic situation. And sometimes they might cause a lot of destruction in the house. They might bark all day long, even some extremes where they're eating the doors, trying to get out, or urinating, defecating because they're so terrified about being left alone. So it can be really hard for people to deal with. It's important to know it's not necessarily an issue to do with their relationship with you. And sometimes there might be cases where the dog is just bored and frustrated. So frustration might sometimes be the cause of this as well. And there is some really nice research being done at the University of Lincoln, which I think is going to help a lot for people working with these kinds of issues as it becomes kind of more widely known. Essentially, separation anxiety is a diagnosis that has to come from a vet, or at least it does where I am, and I'm not a vet. But the approach that seems to work with this is a desensitization. So essentially not leaving the dog alone for any longer than they can handle. And that's really hard because people have lives to live. They have to go out for work. And so it means recruiting like a village of people to help you to make sure that there is always someone there with the dog to keep the dog company. And then very, very gradually over time, you can increase the amount of time that the dog is comfortable being left alone for. But it is a specialism, and there are people who just do separation related issues, and those kinds of trainers can really help to make a difference.
They're worth their weight in gold, aren't they?
I think so, but it's still a slow process that takes time, but they will be there cheering you along all the way.
Yeah, absolutely. Very, very intensive stuff, but very rewarding when it comes right for you. So in terms of your own practice, what are the common things that you see more often than others?
Right now, I'm taking a break from seeing clients because it took me a lot of work to finish this book, and I couldn't do everything at once. Which we'll come on
to, I promise.
So I had to take a break. But I think because I also work with cats, one of the things I get quite often is actually dog-cat issues. So the challenge there is often that people just expect the cat to adjust to the dog, and that's not how it works. The most important thing as far as dog-cat relations go is actually the cat, and people aren't used to thinking about what makes a cat comfortable, what makes a cat feel happy. How do you do a slow introduction where the cat is going to be happy? And of course, by the time they come to me, they've skipped that slow introduction and they've missed that opportunity. So they've already got problems of the dog chasing the cat, or the cat being too scared to come into a room where the dog is, for example. It's really thinking about things from the cat's point of view, making sure the cat feels safe and is safe, that makes a big, big difference, rather than the dog. And everyone's expecting to focus on the dog. So they're a bit surprised when I start saying, well, how many hiding spaces does your cat have in this room? And do they have a good cat tree? And, you know, what can you do to make high up spaces for the cat to go to, and so on? But it makes a big difference.
They realise that the way to solve the dog issue is to help the cat, or at least protect the cat, ensure that your cat is protected and safe. And that brings me to the interesting point that you work both with dogs and cats. You're already the author of 2 very successful books, one on dogs and one on cats. But essentially, the way that mammals tend to learn is very similar across the board, isn't it? The principles that we apply to dog training can be applied to cats too, and they can learn just as easily.
Yeah, the stereotype of cats is that they don't learn. But I think almost everyone has accidentally taught their cat a recall cue when they get the treats out the cupboard and they start rattling the packet and the cat comes running to get a treat. So everyone does actually know that their cat can be trained. It's just that they don't think about it. But the same principles apply. So you can use positive reinforcement to train your cat, which means you give them little rewards for every behavior that you want to see repeated in order to increase the frequency of it happening. But with cats, they have to be tiny, tiny rewards because they really are a lot smaller than most dogs. So you have to think about that. And the other thing is most cats don't have a history of being trained. So even if you're used to training dogs, like even a very young puppy has had some kind of training experience, your cat probably hasn't. So it may take them a little while to get the hang of it. They may need more frequent breaks because it's going to be quite tiring for them. And also they can have a tendency to be a bit grabby and desperate to get the treats from you. So you have to think about how you're going to deliver it without getting claws sometimes, depending on the cat. Yes. My cat is always like, give me the treat, swiping for it. So like in those cases, you can put it in a bowl and give them the bowl, or you can put it on a spoon or something, or have a squeezy tube that they can lick from, so that you're not giving it in your hand and not risking being scratched or bitten by an overexcited cat.
Sound piece of advice. I used to have a ginger Tom called Oscar, who was the most fabulous cat. He loved food, but he would always take it gently, which was lucky. And he knew the sound. At the time I rode a motorcycle, he always knew the sound of the motorcycle. He learned that and would meet me at the back door whenever he heard it arriving. But he would follow you into town.
Sorry, go on. So sweet. Yeah, no, that's so sweet. That's lovely. What a special bond you had with him. That's amazing.
He was absolutely fantastic. He was remarkable, was Oscar. He was, they broke the mold. This is a question from Nina, actually, and I think it's quite an interesting one. And she asked, do you think in society generally, we expect more of our dogs today in terms of behavior than we used to? And how should we as trainers be helping with that?
In a way, that's hard to judge, but on the other hand, we can think of societal changes. So, where I live now, it used to be the case that a lot of dogs were allowed free roam. So, you might go out for a walk and find someone's dog had taken itself out for a walk as well. And that's something that doesn't happen anymore. And I think that is one big change. So, dogs are much more confined. They have less freedom, I think, than in the past. And in some ways, that's a good thing because they're less likely to get hit by cars and so on. But the other thing, I think people do have quite high expectations of their dog. And I think in particular, there's this very widely held belief that dogs are always good for us, that a dog is really good for us psychologically, mentally, and also in terms of the exercise that we might get. And I think that's quite difficult if someone has a fearful, anxious dog and they are really struggling. I think that belief that the dog is meant to be good for you makes it harder for the person who is struggling in those situations because they haven't got this life that they were expecting with their dog. And then, yeah, everyone expects dogs to behave quite well. And so, there's also this feeling of shame, perhaps, if your dog is misbehaving, or that these days someone might take a video and put you on social media while your dog's being, misbehaving, barking and lunging or whatever. And then you'll be really, really embarrassed by that. And I think that makes it harder too. So I think there are quite high expectations, both for having a dog and for how dogs behave in society. And that does make it more difficult.
Because a lot of people think that dogs should behave in a certain way and shouldn't do certain things. And that can put a lot of pressure on people when their dogs aren't doing that, when they're behaving in a different way.
It does. And again, if you think of those outdated ideas about dog training, some of them tell us things which are nonsensical, actually, about whether or not your dog can go on the sofa and the bed. But people then feel guilty because they let their dog on the sofa, and it doesn't matter. It's fine to let your dog on the sofa. But some of those old-fashioned dog training ideas have kind of permeated through, and they make it hard as well. So people feel bad if things aren't working out. But actually, it's really good for dogs to have opportunities to engage in normal doggy behaviors, like sniffing, like playing, like being able to run, and so on. If your dog jumps all over someone in a friendly greeting, it might be embarrassing and it might not be what they wanted, but at least your dog is being friendly, and that's really nice.
Absolutely. When I first have conversations with clients, they often say, I know I shouldn't do this, but, and that's generally around things like going out at the door first, or letting the dogs on the sofa or the bed. And they're often very surprised when all I say is, well, are they guarding it? No, then it's fine. Whether you want your dog to be on your sofa or not is entirely up to you. As you say, it's great for the bond.
I get that a lot as well. I get people say things like, well, my dog is resource guarding their food bowl, but is it because I let them sleep on the bed? I know I shouldn't let them sleep on the bed. And it's fine for the dog to sleep on the bed, as you say, so long as it's safe, so long as they're not guarding the bed, then it would be an issue. But most dogs don't. Most dogs are just really happy to sleep on the bed with their guardian. If you don't want them to, that's fine too. It's like, it's a choice. But people have been led to believe that it is going to cause issues with their dog, and it doesn't. And it's such a shame that people have this headspace where they're feeling guilty over something that it doesn't matter at all.
Yeah. You've given us a lot of stuff there. You've given us a lot of information, a lot of really sound advice. If I was to bring you onto the Sociable Dog podcast and say you could only deliver one piece of advice to everybody. Now, I wouldn't do that because that's not the kind of guy I am. But if I were to do that, what would that one piece of advice, what would you want them to go away with?
I think if I could only have one piece of advice, I would say use food to train your dog. Because if you're using food to train your dog, most of the time you're using positive reinforcement. That means you're using it to motivate your dog to do behaviors that you want to see more of. It means you're avoiding issues to do with aversive methods. So that's really helpful too. So it's also really beneficial for the bond between you and your dog, because it helps to make training fun. And some of those lovely feelings of expecting the food are going to wear off on you. So your dog is also going to see you as this wonderful provider of food. And it's really effective. It works really well. It even seems to work a bit better than aversive methods. I mean, aversive methods work, but they have these issues. There's some research that suggests that using food or other positive methods to train your dog is very effective, more so than other methods. So it would be that, use food to train your dog.
Because aside from some of the other outcomes that can occur with aversive training, you develop negative emotional responses, don't you? Or the dog does.
Yeah, if you're using aversive methods, then unfortunately, the dog is going to associate that negative thing, whether it's a tug on the leash or being shouted at or an electric shock or whatever. They're going to associate that with the situation that they're in and with the person who is there at the time, which is you. And you don't want your dog to form negative associations with you. That's not why we get dogs. We want them to have positive associations. So the opposite side of that, if you're using food to train your dog, then that is helping them develop positive associations with you. And it's a welfare issue. It's a welfare issue for dogs. If you've been using aversive methods, it even becomes a welfare issue that they're around you, because they will remember that you've used those methods in the past. They know that this has happened in the past, so they might simply be more stressed and anxious in your presence. So it's a really big deal which method you use. And that's why it's so important to use food to train your dog. And of course, you could use play, you could use affection. Sometimes people want to use praise as positive reinforcement, but that doesn't really work unless the dog has learned that when you say good dog, that means that a treat is coming their way. Then it might do, because then the good dog is working to signal that food is coming. But otherwise, praise on its own is not enough. It does actually need to be food, and affection and play can work sometimes, or opening the door and letting the dog outside, for example. Sometimes life rewards can work too.
Yeah, whatever floats their boat, really, isn't it?
But food works for all dogs.
Yes,
and then it
absolutely.
comes down to deciding which type of food is going to be best for this training situation or this particular dog, and so on. And that's another issue, but food works brilliantly well.
Yes, I sometimes have people saying, oh, they're not really interested in food. And my response is, they all have their price.
Yes, I like that.
Because it's all economics is what I'm always telling people. It's all about economics. Now I'm finally going to let you talk about your wonderful new book, Bark, which is a superb mix of science and straightforward explanation and anecdote, as well as evidence. It's rich in the way that it manages to put the scientific theory across to people. My question is, do the people you work with respond well to hearing that the advice you're giving is backed up by science? How powerful is that? Because let's face it, behaviour science has been around and advancing for a long time, and both you and I know that, but it doesn't get talked about all that much in the mainstream.
It doesn't get talked about all that much. And if you think about some of the really basic discoveries that we use, they're from over 100 years ago. But the science has continued to advance. And I think by definition, if someone comes to me, they know that they're going to get that. So that I get the kind of people who are going to be interested in that anyway. But I think people like to know that something is evidence-based because they like to know that it's going to work. And the other thing is that we didn't used to have canine science. That's a relatively new thing that's been around for, I guess, 25 years now, 25 years ago when it first started. So we know a lot more about dogs than we used to. And I think it surprises people to think that scientists didn't used to be particularly interested in dogs or cats. And they used to think that animals didn't have emotions. And now we know that they're sentient. And it makes such a difference to how we treat them. And it means that we have to think about providing positive experiences for our pet dogs, as well as preventing cruelty, obviously. So it makes us think about things in a slightly different way, have more of a focus on ensuring that dogs have those positive opportunities to engage in normal doggy behaviors and so on. And I think that's really helpful. And I think even if someone has had a dog their whole life, there are things that we know now that we didn't used to know that have changed. And it's really helpful for people to seek out some of that information, to want to learn more about dogs. The good thing is that actually people do seem to be really quite interested. You see a lot of newspaper articles or news items about canine science these days in a way that you never used to, and about feline science too. And sometimes there'll be a story and it just goes through all the newspapers and everyone's talking about it, a particular study that's just happened. And I think that's really nice. And I think it's really good for people to know that we are always learning. Everyone is always learning. You and I are always learning all the time too. And I think that's important too. And that's what keeps me interested all the time, because I love learning new things about dogs too.
And that brings me to a question which is really about what the science and the research currently is really piquing your interest. I know when I was writing my book, I was really intrigued by some of the new citizen science projects where academics are getting dog owners involved on a very large scale to report on health, behavior, how they age, etc. So what's piquing your interest?
Yeah, I think the citizen science projects are really fun because it means that anyone can take part in science, even if they don't happen to live near a university with a canine science research team. I love some of the research on dogs' sensitivity to rewards. So there's a couple of studies that I really like telling people about, because dogs were trained to run along a treadmill and they were going to get different kinds of rewards at the end, either a piece of kibble or a piece of sausage, and they run faster to get the sausage. And I think that's really fun finding. Whether it was one piece of kibble or 5 pieces of kibble didn't make a difference. With a similar setup, scientists decided to test, do dogs prefer the same favorite treat all of the time, or would they prefer different treats? And this is a fun one, because I think most people would say, okay, my dog prefers sausage. So suppose that is one of the options, and the others might be, I don't know, a liver treat or a piece of cheese or whatever. Really, really good treats. In this case, it turns out it depended on the dog. So you need to know your individual dog. So some dogs would say, okay, I'm all about the sausage. I'm going to run super fast to get that sausage. But other dogs preferred it when there was a variety. So they would be, okay, I'm a bit bored of the sausage now. I'll run a bit faster to get the cheese. And I think that's a really fun study. It must have been nice for the dogs to take part. I like just thinking about the dogs taking part and getting all these wonderful bits of food just for running along to the bowl. But also, it's so relevant to our lives with our dogs, because how often do we ask a dog to come to us? And how often does someone only have a piece of kibble or something, not even anything, to give the dog when they've run to you? If you have that piece of sausage or tripe stick or whatever it is that your dog loves, this study shows that your dog is sensitive to that. So I think it helps to encourage people to actually take really good rewards with them when they're teaching their dog to come when called.
Doesn't it just endorse our argument often made that you should mix it up, that you should use a variety of treats? And because after all, we like a bit of variety in our food, don't we? It'd be awfully dull if all we had was cocktail sausages for the rest of our lives, wouldn't it?
It would.
Now, you've written books about dogs and cats. They're wonderful. They're all great. But having already written more than one book, what made you feel that you needed to write this one with the kind of focus it has on fear and reactivity in particular?
I wanted to write something because I was working with a lot of people, a lot of shelter dogs and people who were just adopting shelter dogs. And I wanted to have something that I could refer people like that to, that would help them through this really difficult transition, because it can be a tough transition. These were people who were adopting dogs that they knew had behavior issues rooted in fear and anxiety. And I think sometimes understanding the principle of counter conditioning is one thing, actually putting it into practice is another. And there are lots of things that people find hard about that. So I wanted to find something, a way of saying basically how to do this that would be easier for people to understand. So there is some technical information in the book because it's essential in order for people to do a good job of that. But I've tried to present it in a way that makes it easy for people to look at it and say, okay, this is what I need to know. This is what I need to do. And of course, you can always hire a dog trainer to help if you need it, but it's really hard having a fearful and anxious dog. Even if people are going into it knowing that it's going to be hard because they know that's the kind of dog that they're adopting from a rescue, then it still feels tough. It's so inspiring to see people when they manage to change the dog's life, they manage to change their own life to suit the dog. That is so rewarding, so wonderful. But it can be hard to get there. And I just wanted to make a way for people to find it a bit easier to know what to do in those situations when their dog is terrified, basically, and to give them hope that there are things they can do that will make a big difference.
Is there anything else that you'd like to say about it?
Well, it's divided into sections. So it's got a beginning section that has lots of useful information for anyone whose dog is fearful or anxious or reactive. And then it has a set of chapters on different specific issues that show you how to apply it in those particular situations. Lots of colleagues have shared good advice with me as well. I've put in stories about my own dogs, which I've got stories about my own pets in Wag and Purr as well. So if people have read those books, they can read subsequent stories about those pets in Bark as well. And that's often one of the things that people tell me they've enjoyed about the book. So I hope that people will find it really useful and interesting as well. It was a real pleasure to be able to speak to some of my colleagues for this book. And the thing is, through WAG and Purr, I've got stories of my own pets. And that was a decision I made at the start of WAG, whether to focus mainly on stories of my own pets or to include a whole range of pets. And there are kind of advantages and disadvantages to both, but I've put in stories about my own pets. And I think in this book, especially, it's an advantage because, well, for one thing, there's continuity across the books, but also people can see times when my dog has done things that perhaps I might have wished they wouldn't do, or I have found things have taken a long time to resolve with one of my dogs. But because there's a wide range of fears and anxieties, I thought it was important also to talk to some people whose dogs have different issues than mine have. So, for example, I've got a section on working with my late dog Bodger on fear of loud noises. And I've got some stories about my current dog Pepper, who's a Shih Tzu, and some of the issues we had with him. For example, how long it took him to settle in when he came to live with us. But I've also got stories from colleagues. So I've got a colleague called Bonnie Hartney who adopted an incredibly fearful puppy called Dixie. And she talks about the long process. And she's had this dog, I forget how long now, maybe 9 years or something, a long time. Anyway, so she talks about this progress and how still, even now, there are changes and improvements from year to year. And now this was an absolutely terrified puppy who now will sometimes go and greet people, who has made friends with the neighbors and so on. And you never would have imagined from looking at the puppy that this would be an outcome. So I think that's helpful for people to know. If I'm allowed to say, having read your upcoming book and some of the stories in there that you share about your own work with your own dog, I think that's incredibly valuable too, for the same reason, because I think it helps people to know that even us as dog professionals can have these issues.
You can indeed say that. And
Good.
thank you. Well, Zazie, this has been amazing. I mean, this has just been an incredible insight into your work and what the book's about in particular. So thank you so much for coming on and giving us your wisdom and advice. And I would encourage anybody, I've read this book. I had the privilege of reading this book before it came out, where I was able to give Zazie a quote for her cover, which was a true honor. And I can only recommend this really highly. It's a great book.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to chat with you. It's been a real pleasure.
You're very welcome. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.